All right, well, it's great. It's still my great pleasure. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tina Röck from Dundee, who works on a whole variety of topics, phenomenology, process philosophy, a little bit of Aristotle around the edges, and is really concerned with questions around ontology, so questions about what there is. And the author of, is it 2021, Dynamic Realism, Uncovering the Reality of Becoming Through Phenomenology and Process Philosophy.
Yeah,
and
it was published 22, but the editors made me do that title.
Okay.
It's typically German, unpronounceable.
But today she's going to be talking on a topic, the question of which is there truth in a dynamic world, dispelling a dogma of thought? Okay, thanks, Tina.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here. And today I want to talk about an evolution of my research. So as Henry already said, I'm very interested in phenomenology and also process ontology. So this idea that reality is fundamentally dynamic, a process, changing and evolving. And whenever I present this idea from a metaphysical or ontological perspective, one of the answers you get immediately is, yeah, but what about knowledge? What about truth? If reality is a changing process, if it's constantly undergoing changes, if it's constantly evolving, how can we ever know something about that? And now my current research project, I've just gotten started on this, so this is still in the making, is about thinking through the concept of truth and what the concept of truth could mean in a world of change. In engaging with truth, I also engage a lot with analytic philosophy, because I think analytic philosophy does have a lot to offer in that area, and you will see this in this talk. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to all the comments. So what if our reality was fundamentally dynamic and interrelated? What if reality was a process? What if the stable entities that we seem to observe are simply very, very slow-moving processes? Current developments in both science and technology provide abundant data as well as arguments for such a dynamic reconceptualization of the world. We have learned that mountains, continents, planets, our galaxy, the whole universe has become at one point, is moving and changing now, and is going to move and change into the future. At least that's the accepted scientific stance on this matter. Furthermore, so that's reality, or as we already experience it, as we know it. Furthermore, modern technology both contributes to and speeds up this fundamental relational dynamicity. Digital technologies connect us with the speed of information, and automatization allows for much quicker production and distribution of goods than ever before. These rapid changes and the emerging all-pervasive connectivity also enable an economic revolution, namely the move that we're currently experiencing from economies of ownership to sharing economies. We are shifting, or our economy is shifting from a focus on production of things or entities or things that can be possessed, to a focus on services, on evoking feelings, enabling experiences. So it's more about listening to the music than possessing the music, watching the film than having the DVD at home, right? So these are all phenomena of desubstantialization, phenomena of creating a process that is enhanced and pushed through relations, through sharing, through connection, and through speed, right? You need all of these elements to enable this move from substantial static things or entities you can possess towards this new kind of economy that we're moving into. And these processes encourage us to shift out the way we conceive of material resources, of nature, of reality as a whole. We have more and more evidence that it's actually valuable and important to think about things in processes and dynamic relation than to think in them in terms of static entities. And this insight, so in a certain sense, a lot of philosophy, a lot of contemporary intellectual work is already moving from this focus on static entities towards more dynamic ways of seeing and thinking. It's a shift towards the non-substantial, a shift towards the distributed, the shared, and the changing. Now, one key promise of my research is that our conceptual resources, the words and concepts, the ways we speak, haven't caught up to this shift. The way we conceptualize knowledge, truth, and justice largely remain grounded in the presupposition of stable entities, of individuals. They remain grounded on the presupposition of stable materiality, and therefore they're simply inadequate to come to terms with the existing and emerging relational and dynamic aspects of the world. That's why I believe there's an urgent need for a pragmatic conceptual framework that's adequate to the dynamic world we live in. So even if you don't buy my... Would you mind turning your mic off? Thank you. So even if you don't buy my argument that reality is processual, it is very much observable that technology and modern science is uncovering a more processual nature and developing a more processual culture at the very least, right? And at least for that, we do need concepts and ways of arguing and ways of thinking to come to terms with this complex relational dynamicity. Yeah. So I furthermore think, I'm a metaphysician, and I believe that any attempt to systematically understand the world, whether it be static or dynamic, presupposes a metaphysical system and a structure of how we think phenomena can, well, or should ideally be ordered. And I think we all agree that such systems shouldn't willfully alter or change what there is. So we don't want to develop a metaphysical system that kind of like sits on top of the phenomena and shifts the way the phenomena actually show themselves. It should be adapting to the phenomena. So our system should be responsive to the phenomena. It should help in ordering what we encounter in a meaningful, efficient, and helpful way. However, and as I already mentioned, most metaphysical frameworks, positions, and modes of structuring the world presuppose stable, well-defined, or at least definable, in theory, definable individual entities or structures. And thus they propose some form of stable substance or stable structure to categorize and order reality. And any mode of thinking and conceptually ordering the world that's based on stable entities, I will here in this talk refer to as based in substance ontology or based in SO thinking. So this is just a mode of thinking which grounds everything in substance or in stability or in entity, right? And we're so steeped in this mode of thinking that it's really hard to actually see the relational dynamicity. So our history is predisposed the way we think, the way we speak, towards focusing on what's essential and disregarding the rest. And it's this focus itself that makes it hard to see that in actual fact, the things we encounter aren't static, aren't stable. If we observe them over a period of time and with a large, in enough detail, then it's pretty evident that everything around us changes, right? And this lack of engagement with the dynamic complexity is mirrored in the way we use language. It's very evident in the way we use language. Everyday concepts like entity, object, material resource, they are always understood in terms of objectivity, identity, separability, being atemporal and fundamentally unrelated. And just because the terms we use focus our mind on these stable aspects, we so often are blinded to the processual reality that happens around us. So if we don't change our language, we will not be able to see the actual processual dynamicity that we encounter, right? There are other ways of thinking. There are other ways of thinking that have already been proposed. If you look at Heidegger, for example, his idea of the fourfold to understand matter, process to understand reality or the event, those are first attempts to provide concepts that help us think reality as more dynamic. Yeah. So, in order to grasp what makes the modern world or the contemporary world, we need more dynamic concepts. And we need concepts that are, I argue, grounded in process thought, or what I will refer to as processual thinking, dynamic thinking, or PO. Those are all for me synonyms. So I'm less interested in which position precisely we should have ontologically or metaphysically. I'm more interested in these general structures, in these general oppositions, which is an oversimplification, I'm aware, but in order to be able to get this argument off the ground, we need to start somewhere, yeah? And I wouldn't argue to have a combative stance, so it's not either substance ontology or process ontology. I think it's a matter of employing the type of conceptualization, the type of structure that's relevant to the issue that I'm looking at, right? If I want to understand the nature of, I don't know, something that is relatively stable or static, like an idea, something abstract, then a substantial view might work very effectively. But when I want to understand the concrete reality we live in, the world we actually experience, that's when it fails, is my argument. So to make this, to render this path a possible path for thought, I think it's important to engage with two dogmas of substantial thinking, which are two dogmas that shape our general way of thinking, right? And for millennia, these two presuppositions or dogmas have made it impossible to even consider a processual view to be a viable view. So the first dogma of substantial thought that I've already mentioned holds that there is no truth or knowledge in a dynamic reality, since processes and changes can never be adequately grasped through clear concepts, nor fully represented in propositional language. And this argument has already been presented by Plato in his Catullus. He's made up very clear, yeah? And therefore, no processes. They can't be real because we can't know them. And if they are real, then we can't know them, so why would we deal with them? The second dogma consists in the claim that self-identity is a fundamental aspect of existence. Apologies. Okay. That self-identity is fundamental to existence, right? As Strawson put it, no entity without identity, right? If that's true, then in principle, something like a relational, i.e. an open or changeable process, cannot exist as an entity because it has no identity. So by definitionem, we just made sure there are no processes, right? These dogmas are rooted in substantial presuppositions. So in and of themselves, there aren't enough material to discredit processual positions, but they've become the main way of our thinking and speaking. So it's important to debunk these presuppositions, right? So in the answer to the first dogma, that there is no truth or knowledge in a world of change, in what follows, I will try to present a different way, an alternative way of conceiving knowledge and truth by developing an understanding of adequate truth and dynamic concepts. And this, I really want to emphasize this idea of a dynamic truth is really complex, and it's really not helpful for most everyday tasks. So it's not to supplant or take the place of a representational idea of truth or truth as correspondence. It is to supplement truth when the object that we're interested in is sufficiently complex, sufficiently relational, or sufficiently dynamic to make it impossible to come to terms with it through other concepts of truth. Yeah. This, in answer to the second dogma, I have developed a definition of a dynamic existence or dynamic being that preserves the creative openness of process without turning it again into a thing, without turning it into a static category. And I've done so in my book. So therefore today I want to look at the first issue about truth. Yeah. So let's get into it. Much of Western thought concerning truth is centered around the conviction that truth is a conceptual or linguistic expression that it represents facts, that is similar to or is like what's actually the case. So there's a relation between our expression and, you know, fill in whichever one you prefer: proposition, judgment, concept, idea on the one side, thinking on the one side, and objective reality, matters of fact, states of affairs, whatever else on the other side. Whatever precise ontological linguistic entity you fill into those spaces is of less interest to me than that we always have those two spaces and that we think that truth is a certain relationship between those two spaces. Yeah. And this understanding as truth of truth as likeness is then a problem for process thought, because if what there is in the object space changes constantly, then I can never represent it, then I can never hold this relationship in balance such that we can produce truth and or knowledge. If what our statements or concepts refer to changes in the very act of us referring to it, there's no way of conceptually grasping and or ordering what there is. So that's already Plato's Cratylus, right? So now let's look at this relation between what is thought and what is real, or whatever other definition you want to take. The relation of likeness or resemblance between thought or statement and what is thought about or what is the case is traditionally referred to as adequatio. And this is a Latin term that means making equal or making similar. Right? So how do we determine the similarity or the likeness between thought and what is the case when it comes to the concrete dynamic world we're living in? Let's look at the term. The Latin term adequatio is a compositum, so it's a combination of two things, namely ad, which means towards or adding, and the substantivized form of the verb aequo, I make equal or I level, right? So the term adequatio indicates a combination of moving towards, at, a process of creating equality. It does not indicate a state of affairs. It does not indicate an attribute or a stable static relationship. What it does indicate, if you look closely at the term and you ignore the substantialization, which we can talk about later, what it actually describes is an ongoing process of making similar or aligning. So adequatio, if I do adequatio, in the process of adequare, I continuously make sure that whatever is represented and how I represent it remain in sufficient alignment. Right? So it's not something that's there or not there, it's something that's continuously maintained and continuously created. So it's a process of creating a correspondence between matters of fact and propositions or judgments about these matters of fact. Truth in this reading of adequare does not simply exist once formed. It is a result that needs to be maintained continuously by ensuring that it remains in adequate alignment. And this process of alignment can now be either fostered between propositions and matters of fact, as in what the usual correspondence theory describes, or between various beliefs, coherence theory of truth, or as a process of continuous improvement of the pragmatic value of our beliefs and judgments in pragmatic approaches. So you can apply this idea of adequate truth to all other major ways of understanding truth that we have. However, this is not the entire story. The term adequate, at least in its modern English use, has an additional meaning. Namely, we use the term adequate to refer to the acceptability, appropriateness, or suitability of something. So in my understanding, I'm combining both of those meanings of the term adequate. That means that an adequate truth combines the idea of adequacy as a quality of being appropriate with the adequatio as a process of making or creating similarity or alignment in such a way that the quality of adequacy, of being suitable, characterizes both the result of the process, so what we consider truth or knowledge, and the process itself. This understanding of truth brings with it many shifts in the way we engage truth. So for example, it allows for a range of different degrees of adequacy to be considered relevant, to constitute knowledge or truth. An adequate truth is not binary in the sense that something is either true or false. Instead, it allows for degrees of adequacy. It is context sensitive. In an everyday context, the question, what's in this glass, might be adequately answered with the reply, water. This answer would be true enough, so to speak, for most contexts. In other contexts, this answer might be too general or in other ways inadequate. I'll get to this in more detail. If I'm not taking too long, let's see. So when we redefine it in this way, the idea of adequate truth can ground the possibility of a truly dynamic epistemology, as it does not propose truth to be something ultimate, to be found or uncovered, nor does it presuppose a stable object that can be grasped once and for all. So even if the thing is changing, because we're keeping alignment going, it's an ongoing process, that change is not a problem. So it does not presuppose a stable object that can be grasped once and for all. It's an ongoing, aligned encounter between mind and world, and thus an adequate truth is not merely subjective. Instead, it's created in continuous alignment with and attention to the ongoing, unfolding matters of fact. Adequate truth is plural, context-sensitive, but it is so without leading to relativism or constructivism or forms of idealism. And I will get into that a bit more later. So the first idea of truth as continuously unfolding, as unfolding in a way that's continuously shaped by many factors, shares some similarities with Heidegger's understanding of aletheia, truth as aletheia. This concept too considers truth to be an encounter, a meeting of Dasein and world, an encounter that's historical, temporal, and that leads to new ways of aligning thought and thing. Of course, aletheia is on a much more global level or metaphysical level, but the structure is analogous. And aletheia as well does not imply either relativism or subjectivism, because the modes of unconcealment are grounded in being and not in a subject, not in Dasein. So that's what guarantees or what makes relativism impossible in the Heideggerian sense. And the second element that I was talking about, that there are different standards or types of truth that can be adequate or suitable to different kinds or types of objects or judgments, does have roots in the history of philosophy. And here Aristotle makes an appearance. Aristotle, for example, argues that only judgments about composed entities can be true or false. Judgments about asyntheta, so non-composed entities, can neither be true nor false, because there's not something you could predicate something off. It's not composed, it's just a whole. But we can merely, judgments about asyntheta can merely provide insight or access, allow us to know, or fail to provide access. They do not lead to knowledge. This implies that there is a different standard of truth and knowledge that's adequate for asyntheta than for composed entities. In the sixth logical investigation, Husserl makes a similar point when he says that positing sentences, which is a very strange, for me, strange translation of setzende Urteilsintentionen, cannot be true or false, but they are merely either fulfilled or unfulfilled, and they can be fulfilled to varying degrees. So all of these elements are already present in Husserl. Finally, Wilfrid Sellers, who endorses a pragmatic theory of truth, and he describes a variety of truths, even when it comes to empirical knowledge. It discusses picturing as an empirical adequacy relation that is a mode of correspondence other than truth that can accompany truth in the case of basic empirical statements. So what Sellers says, even when we talk basic empirical statements, even there's different forms of truth that can pertain, right? So this idea of different levels or layers of truth for different contexts has precedence in the history of philosophy, even if it was never the prevalent mode to think about truth. The prevalent mode was always to find the one true way of thinking about truth. So I argue, or I believe, that this concept of adequate truth has a variety of advantages. It allows for truth to be understood as a process of alignment that can be adequate, that can be present to various degrees, and thus allowing for a more complex understanding of truth than we have available with the traditional binary of truth as either present or absent, without rendering it relative. And it's not relative because the relational context in which this truth is situated binds our ability to interpret this truth, right? So there are certain negotiable thresholds of adequacy or adequacy criteria that any truth claim needs to pass in order to be able to be considered truth. So judgments or propositions that refer to dynamic and relational events cannot simply be considered either true or false, certain, evident, or to provide a straightforward correspondence in a traditional sense. Instead, there is a standard of adequacy that they can either pass or fail. If the proposition or the account in question cannot clear the standard of adequacy that has been agreed on, it can be considered as false and simply disregarded. If it clears the standard, then it can be considered true. However, the story doesn't end here. Propositions or accounts can pass this minimum standard to different degrees. They can be adequate to different degrees, thus always allowing room for even more adequate readings and more adequate presentations. So judgments or propositions can be more or less effective, more or less faithful, more or less adequate in grasping or expressing the processes in question. Truth is not something pre-existing that can simply be discovered, nor is it merely subjective, since it has to be created in a way that ascertains that our statements and the actual goings on do in fact continue to align. So also the phenomena limit the way this adequacy can work or has to work. The concept of adequate truth acknowledges that there are multiple but not infinite ways of creating this alignment, and that these multiple ways have varying degrees of adequacy or appropriateness. So this is what I wanted to say about the concept that I'm developing, and now I want to say a couple of things about why I think this is an important discussion to have. And in recent years, the discrepancy between the truth of propositions as linguistic presentations of matters of fact and the actual complexity of concrete life that I mentioned in the beginning has become incredibly visible. The phenomenon I would point to in this context is the rising relevance of terms like post-truth or post-fact culture. And while very influential thinkers like the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker argue that these terms are merely fashionable nonsense, because he thinks we do have the means to identify falsehoods, empirical science. I don't think it's quite that easy. Well, granted, we have vast amounts of really reliable scientific data, and the argument here is simply that there are aspects, and I'm not saying all of it, but aspects of concrete, relational, and dynamic reality that cannot be grasped and adequately expressed through the scientific method or in abstract propositional language. Social, legal, cultural, philosophical, psychological, spiritual truths are just as relevant as scientific truths, but they do not conform to the scientific standard for truth, and nor can they grasp by the scientific method. These truths have various differing adequacy criteria. They imply different processes of alignment. What I'm trying to say is that up until, or even today, anything that doesn't conform to the kind of truth standards presented by the sciences, by maths or by logic, can very easily be dismissed as falsehood. And that's the problem. Science doesn't have a problem. The immediate devaluation for everything that doesn't follow the scientific method, even if it's structured in such a way that it cannot be grasped by the scientific method, the immediate devaluation of those aspects, that's the problem. And that's why I think there's a lot of loss of interest and faith in even thinking about truth or thinking about a shared reality or shared understanding of what there is. In these different contexts, the process of alignment cannot be the scientific method. It has to be something like an uncovering, a constitution, a co-creation, a negotiation, a dialectic encounter, an unconcealment. And there's also the issue of power. Many in our society have been excluded from contributing to the process of truth and truth evaluation and truth production. And the consensus on what counts as truth and doesn't count as truth has been enforced in certain areas and in certain ways. most of us have become passive consumers of objective truths that come from various different experts that have various different truth standards and thus appear to be contradicting each other. So if you speak to an epidemiologist and a politician and another scientist about one topic, they will have different answers. Why? Because they have different truth adequacy standards, right? That doesn't mean that they contradict each other. They just look at the same problem from different perspectives. One final thing I wanted to address, because I'm running out of time, so I'll try to make it short. There's this potential worry, right? If our words and our sentences do not simply correspond to the world, if our scientific theories do not simply grasp or express what there is, then why are our modes of speaking and conducting science so successful, right? And I would say that's just simply a tendentious question. Both propositional language and science provide us with explanatory models of what there is. These tools do not attempt to represent or copy reality itself. That's not the main aim here. If we look at the actual use of propositions and at actual scientific practices, then I think it's fair to claim that these practices do not actually aim at providing an adequate account of what there is. That adequate account of what there is remains the aim of philosophy, I would say, including the philosophy of language and the philosophy of science. So when I talk about propositions in science, I'm not talking about philosophy of language and I'm not talking about philosophy of science. That's a different perspective, right? Declarative sentences or propositions are generally used to transmit, convey, or store matters of facts or states of affairs, independently of whether they are true or false. This contrasts with other uses of language, like poetic use of language, for example. Propositional language is just a use and a view of language that considers the meaning of declarative sentences to be the only relevant aspect of communication and language. However, language thus reduced to its propositional content cannot come to terms with and needs to exclude or disregard elements of experience that are fundamentally concrete as well as vague, complex, and interconnected. But again, in the way we use language, propositions are not aimed at grasping reality perfectly. They are aimed at orientating ourselves, at communicating information, and at various ways of collaboration, right? If we look at science, the picture is similar. The main aim of modern science, I think, is to understand how things work, so that we can manipulate these processes through technology and engineering to use them to our advantage. Contemporary science aims at understanding that is geared towards technical manipulation, so that data that seems inconsequential, ineffective, or useless at the outset is dismissed quite early on. Scientific practice does not aim at understanding, grasping, or expressing what is. Its aim is the creation of hypotheses that can be tested, and its aim is to provide an understanding of the causal mechanisms of any given process. And as a matter of fact, this scientific practice is already characterized by the idea of adequacy standards for different truth procedures that an experimental outcome must clear in order to be considered relevant. For example, any findings in statistical investigations must clear the relevant p-values to be adequate. Calculations must be precise and exact to merit consideration in the field of mathematics, while there's a certain degree of leeway or acceptable range of precision in engineering, for example. The acceptable sample sizes vary from field to field, and so does the acceptable degree of detail. There is a sheer infinite list of variable adequacy standards that shape various scientific truth procedures. There is no such thing as a single scientific standard of truth that would hold in all scientific contexts, let alone non-scientific contexts. The resulting scientific hypotheses that have cleared the relevant adequacy standards are then used to develop explanatory models of what there is. These models, again, are not developed in order to adequately represent or copy reality, but to work, to be efficient. In this case, to work means that these models have a degree of predictive and explanatory power that they are widely accepted as adequate by other experts, and they do not contradict other successful hypotheses or models in substantial ways. If they do, there is other, Kuhn talked about that, but generally speaking, in everyday science, this is what we want from a model. However, even the most accurate representative model is not the same thing as what is modeling, and is not supposed to be. The aim of a model is to simplify, to render the object of investigation less complex and more easily understandable and manipulable. An object is always much more complex and detailed than its model. Consider Magritte's famous painting Ce n'est pas une pipe as an example of a representative model. We can use the painting, I hope you all know it, but it's very famous. We can use the painting as a representative model of the pipe, and we can use it to help understand the workings of a pipe to a degree. We can use it to explain where the tobacco goes, what end needs to be lit, what end is used to inhale the smoke. All of these practical explanations, if followed adequately with a real pipe, will enable the one following the steps to smoke the pipe. But Magritte is right. It is not in fact a pipe, for I can't actually stuff it. I can't light and smoke it. I can furthermore not clean the painting effectively with a pipe cleaner, nor can I sit in my chair and feel the comforting weight of a pipe in my hand. If all I have is a painting, a similar degree of difference separates any scientific model or any model, linguistic or scientific, from the world we live in. As soon as it comes to our ways of interacting with what we encounter, the model will be limited. The actual world is incredibly complex, interrelated, as well as dynamically changing. In scientific investigations, we have to abstract from this dynamic complexity and from the relatedness. We have to create simplified models to even begin to gain useful, practical, and actionable insights. What science investigates is thus generally idealized by, for example, abstracting from all the changes that are not relevant for the experiment in question, and by limiting or ignoring causally ineffective or minimally effective relations. For example, the gravitational pull of the moon is considered negligible in most cases and simply eliminated, so simply not considered. And while this ceteris paribus practice, so this practice of organizing an investigation in such a way that all other factors beyond the ones that we're investigating are stipulated to remain equal, we have a snore there, is a necessary step in constructing repeatable and reliable experiments. So if we didn't have this ceteris paribus practice, we couldn't develop the kind of experiments that we want, repeatable and reliable. However, this process is completely inadequate if the object of investigation is the interrelated, dynamic, actual multiplicity of the world we live in. The concept of adequate truth thus has little to no impact on actual scientific practices of truth generation. First, because these practices have proven to be adequate for the context, and second, because they already seem to employ the principles of adequate truth. Thus, the concept of adequate truth merely maps what's already happening in scientific practice and allows for greater variety of standards of truth to range over different contexts outside of scientific practice. So to sum up, I'm not doing too badly. To sum up, the concept of adequate truth implies that truth is neither a pre-existing matter of fact that can simply be discovered, nor is it merely a subjective construction, since it must be created in a way that ascertains that our statements and the actual goings-on continue to align, at least to the degree implied by the relevant adequacy standard. It further implies that there are multiple, but not infinite ways of creating such alignments, and that these multiple ways can have varying degrees of adequacy or appropriateness, depending on the concrete circumstances. And those concrete circumstances include the research question, the object of research, the methodology, the intended outcome, and so on and so forth. It finally implies that appropriate alignment is not binary, present as truth or absent as falsehood, but present in degrees of adequacy. Thus, the resulting adequate truths retain the ability to be compared and tested conceptually, like traditional truths, as there are these negotiable and testable standards of adequacy. Thank you.